The morning of June 15, 2023, began like any other ceremonial day at Buckingham Palace. The sky hung heavy with grey clouds that threatened rain, but Sergeant Thomas Mitchell had seen worse weather during his 12 years of service in the Queen's Guard. At 34, he had stood motionless through scorching summer heat, bitter winter winds, and torrential downpours that would send ordinary people running for shelter. Today would be no different, or so he thought. Thomas adjusted his iconic red tunic one final time before taking his position outside the palace gates. The black bearskin hat sat perfectly atop his head, its weight familiar and reassuring. His polished boots gleamed despite the humidity, and his rifle rested against his shoulder with practiced precision. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the stoic figure who would remain perfectly still for the next 2 hours. The ceremony he was guarding was particularly special today. Princess Charlotte, now 8 years old and third in line to the throne, was hosting a tea party for children from local hospitals and charities. It was her idea, palace staff had whispered, a gesture that had surprised even her parents with its thoughtfulness. The young princess had specifically requested that the event take place in the palace gardens, where the children could run and play freely while still maintaining the formal atmosphere befitting a royal gathering. As Thomas took his position, he could hear the excited chatter of children beginning to arrive through the palace gates. Their laughter echoed across the courtyard, a sound that never failed to bring a slight smile to his otherwise stern expression, though no one would ever see it beneath his composed exterior. He had a daughter of his own, Emma, who was just 6 years old. She often asked him about his job, wide-eyed with wonder at the idea that her daddy stood guard for real princesses and princes. The first drops of rain began to fall at precisely 10:47 a.m. Thomas felt them land softly on his shoulders, tiny spots of moisture that would soon multiply into something much more challenging. He had checked the weather forecast that morning, noting the 70% chance of precipitation, but royal ceremonies rarely changed for something as mundane as rain. The show, as they say, must go on. Within minutes, the gentle drizzle intensified into a steady downpour. The tourists who had been eagerly photographing him began to scatter, seeking shelter under nearby awnings and shop fronts. Some held umbrellas, others used newspapers or magazines to shield themselves from the increasingly heavy rain. But Thomas remained exactly where he was, his red tunic gradually darkening as it absorbed the moisture, his bearskin hat collecting water that would occasionally drip down past his eyebrows. The palace protocol was clear and unwavering. A guard on ceremonial duty must maintain his position regardless of weather conditions unless specifically relieved by a superior officer or in cases of extreme emergency. Rain, no matter how heavy, did not constitute an emergency. Thomas had stood through worse, and he would stand through this. His training had prepared him for exactly these moments, teaching him to detach his mind from physical discomfort and focus on his duty to protect and represent the crown with dignity. As the rain continued to fall, Thomas could hear the tea party proceeding inside the palace walls. The children's voices carried on the wind, occasionally punctuated by adult laughter and the clinking of china teacups. He imagined Princess Charlotte in her finest dress, probably pink or blue with delicate embroidery, sitting properly at a miniature table while her young guests marveled at their surroundings. The thought of his own daughter enjoying such an experience brought warmth to his chest, despite the cold rain now soaking through his uniform. The water had begun to pool around his boots, creating small puddles that reflected the gray sky above. His red tunic, once vibrant and pristine, had taken on a darker, almost burgundy hue. The brass buttons still gleamed, testament to the hours of polishing he had invested that morning, but everything else about his appearance spoke of a man who had been standing in the rain for over an hour without moving so much as an inch. Passers-by began to take notice of his dedication. A few tourists, despite their own discomfort, paused to take photographs of the guard who remained steadfastly at his post while everyone else sought shelter. Some shook their heads in amazement, others in what might have been concern. An elderly gentleman with a walking stick stopped nearby and spoke quietly to his companion. "Look at that dedication, Margaret. That young man hasn't moved despite this dreadful weather." His voice carried a note of respect that Thomas appreciated, even though he gave no outward sign of having heard. The rain intensified further as the afternoon wore on. What had begun as a gentle shower had evolved into the kind of downpour that sends people running for cover and cancels outdoor events. The palace courtyard, normally bustling with tourists and staff, had largely emptied except for the occasional hardy visitor who braved the weather to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard ceremony that would still take place on schedule. Thomas's mind wandered, as it often did during long periods of standing, to memories that helped pass the time. He remembered his first day of training, how the drill sergeant had made them stand at attention for what felt like hours while he inspected every detail of their uniforms and posture. A guard, the sergeant had bellowed, represents the dignity and strength of the crown. You are not just men in fancy uniforms, you are living symbols of British tradition and resilience. Those words had stuck with Thomas throughout his career. Every time he put on the red tunic and bearskin hat, he felt the weight of centuries of tradition settling on his shoulders. He was part of an unbroken chain stretching back generations, men who had stood their ground in far worse conditions than a rainy London afternoon. Some had stood guard during the Blitz, maintaining their posts even as bombs fell around them. His discomfort today paled in comparison to their sacrifices. The cold was beginning to seep into his bones now. The rain had found every gap in his uniform, trickling down his neck and soaking through to his undergarments. His feet, despite the quality of his boots, were beginning to feel the moisture. Still, he maintained his position with military precision, his rifle at exactly the correct angle, his posture straight and dignified despite the increasingly challenging conditions. A group of school children on a field trip had arrived earlier and were now watching him from inside the visitor center, their faces pressed against the windows. Their teacher was pointing at him, no doubt explaining the role of the Queen's Guard and the importance of duty and dedication. Thomas hoped they would remember this moment, perhaps understanding that commitment to one's responsibilities meant persevering even when circumstances became difficult. The sound of the tea party continued to drift from the palace gardens, though it seemed more subdued now. Thomas wondered if Princess Charlotte was disappointed that the weather had forced them to move indoors, or if she was adaptable enough to find joy in the new circumstances. Children, he had observed, were often more resilient than adults when it came to changes in plans. His own daughter had taught him that lesson many times over. As the second hour of rain began, Thomas noticed palace staff members occasionally glancing in his direction from doorways and windows. He could see concern in their expressions, but he also knew that they understood the protocols as well as he did. No one would suggest he abandon his post for something as common as rain, no matter how heavy it became. The very suggestion would go against everything the Queen's Guard represented. The water running off his bearskin hat had created a small stream down the front of his tunic. His white gloves, once pristine, were now thoroughly soaked and had taken on a slightly grayish tinge from the pollutants in the London rain. Yet his grip on his rifle remained firm and steady, his stance unchanged from the moment he had taken his position nearly 3 hours earlier. A maintenance worker emerged from the palace carrying an umbrella, and, for a moment, Thomas wondered if perhaps an exception might be made. But the worker simply hurried past, focused on his own duties and respecting the guard's commitment to his. This was as it should be, Thomas reflected. The guard's duty was not to be comfortable, but to be present, vigilant, and unwavering in the face of any challenge. The afternoon was beginning to transition toward evening, though the heavy clouds made it difficult to judge the exact time. Thomas estimated he had been standing in the rain for close to 3 hours now, with at least another hour remaining in his shift. His replacement would arrive precisely on schedule, rain or shine, and the ceremony of changing the guard would proceed with the same dignity and precision it had maintained for generations. Inside the palace, he could hear the tea party beginning to wind down. Children's voices were calling out thank yous, and he could imagine the little curtsies and bows being exchanged as the young guests prepared to depart. Princess Charlotte would be saying her goodbyes, probably with the same grace and poise that seemed to come naturally to members of the royal family, even at such a young age. The rain showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying as the day wore on, as if testing the resolve of anyone brave enough to remain outdoors. Thomas accepted this challenge with the same stoic determination he brought to every aspect of his service. Weather was simply another variable to be endured, no different from fatigue, discomfort, or the sometimes demanding behavior of tourists who wanted to make him break character. His thoughts turned again to his daughter Emma, who would be home from school by now, probably doing her homework at the kitchen table while his wife Sarah prepared dinner. They would ask about his day, as they always did, and he would tell them about the rain and the tea party, though he would downplay the difficulty of standing motionless in a downpour for hours. There was no need to worry them with the physical challenges of his job when the honor and privilege of serving more than compensated for any temporary discomfort. As the fourth hour of rain began, Thomas noticed that his dedication had not gone entirely unnoticed. Palace staff members were occasionally taking photographs from windows, documenting what was becoming an extraordinary display of commitment to duty. He would never see these photographs, but somehow knowing they existed gave him a sense of pride. This moment would become part of the unofficial history of the Queen's Guard, a testament to the unwavering dedication that defined their service. The rain had now been falling steadily for 4 hours, and Sergeant Thomas Mitchell had become something of a spectacle. Word had begun to spread through social media about the guard who refused to seek shelter despite the increasingly severe weather. Tourists who had initially fled the downpour were beginning to return, drawn by curiosity and admiration for his unwavering dedication. They stood at a respectful distance under umbrellas and shop awnings, snapping photographs and videos that would soon circulate around the world. Thomas could feel the water that had accumulated in his boots with every subtle shift of weight. His socks were completely saturated, and the leather of his boots, despite their quality construction, had begun to soften from prolonged exposure to moisture. Yet his posture remained military perfect, his rifle positioned at the exact angle prescribed by regulations, his gaze fixed steadily ahead. To any observer, he appeared as immovable and dignified as he had been when the sky was merely overcast 4 hours earlier. The palace courtyard had transformed into something resembling a small lake. Puddles connected with other puddles, creating streams that carried leaves and debris toward the storm drains. The ornate stonework, normally a warm honey color, had darkened to charcoal gray, and the usually manicured flower beds had taken on a sodden, wilted appearance. Still, Thomas maintained his position at the center of it all, a beacon of steadfast duty in an increasingly dramatic scene. Inside the palace, the children's tea party had concluded over an hour ago, but Princess Charlotte had remained near the windows overlooking the courtyard. Palace staff had noticed her frequent glances toward the guard standing in the rain, though they couldn't quite read the expression on her young face. She had asked several questions about the guard's duties, why they stood outside in all weather, and whether they ever got cold or tired. Her inquiries had been answered with appropriate explanations about duty, tradition, and service, but something in her demeanor suggested she was processing information that went beyond simple curiosity. Lady Catherine Morrison, Princess Charlotte's tutor and companion for the day, had been watching the young royals' growing interest in the guard's situation. At 8 years old, Charlotte was beginning to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the world around her, and Lady Morrison recognized the signs of genuine concern taking shape in the princess's mind. The child had inherited her mother's compassionate nature and her great-grandmother's sense of responsibility, a combination that often led to thoughtful gestures that surprised even seasoned palace staff. Lady Morrison, Charlotte had said about 30 minutes earlier, the guard has been standing in the rain for a very long time. Doesn't he need an umbrella? The question was asked with the innocent directness that children possess, but Lady Morrison detected something deeper in the princess's tone. This wasn't merely idle curiosity, it was the beginning of empathy translating into a desire for action. The guards are trained to maintain their posts regardless of weather, Your Royal Highness, Lady Morrison had explained. It's part of their duty to the crown. But, even as she spoke the words, she could see that this explanation, while technically correct, wasn't entirely satisfying to the young princess. Charlotte continued to glance toward the window, her brow slightly furrowed in the way children's faces scrunch when they're trying to work through a complex problem. Meanwhile, Thomas had begun to notice a subtle change in the attention he was receiving. Palace staff members were appearing more frequently in doorways and windows, and he sensed that his situation had become a topic of discussion inside the palace walls. This wasn't unusual in itself. Guards who demonstrated exceptional dedication under challenging circumstances often became subjects of conversation and respect among palace personnel. What felt different today was the quality of attention, as if his endurance in the rain had taken on significance beyond the usual admiration for duty well performed. The cold had settled deep into his bones now. Each breath created a small cloud of vapor that dissipated quickly in the rain, and he could feel his core temperature dropping despite his best efforts to maintain body heat through subtle muscle tension. His hands, encased in soaked white gloves, had lost most feeling, though years of training ensured his grip on the rifle remained secure. The bearskin hat, now thoroughly waterlogged, felt as though it weighed twice its normal amount, but his neck and shoulders bore the burden without visible strain. A television news crew had arrived, having caught wind of the story through social media posts. They set up their equipment under a large umbrella across the courtyard, the reporter speaking in hushed, respectful tones as she described the scene for viewers. "Behind me, you can see a member of the Queen's Guard who has maintained his ceremonial post for over 4 hours despite this torrential downpour. This extraordinary display of dedication has captured the attention of palace staff and visitors alike, demonstrating the unwavering commitment that has made the Queen's Guard a symbol of British resilience and duty." Thomas was aware of the news crew but remained focused on his duty. He had been filmed and photographed countless times during his service, though rarely under such dramatic circumstances. The media attention didn't change his responsibilities or his resolve. If anything, it reinforced the importance of maintaining the highest standards of deportment. He was representing not only himself and his unit, but the entire tradition of royal service that stretched back centuries. As the fifth hour began, palace security approached the news crew to ensure they maintained appropriate distance and conducted their reporting with proper respect for both the guard and the ongoing palace operations. The story was spreading rapidly online, with hashtags like #RoyalGuardReign and #DutyFirst trending on various social media platforms. People around the world were sharing videos of Thomas standing motionless in the downpour, with comments ranging from admiration to concern to amazement at his dedication. Princess Charlotte had been unusually quiet since the tea party ended. She had completed her afternoon lessons with less than her usual enthusiasm, her attention frequently drifting toward the windows. Lady Morrison recognized the signs of a child working through a moral dilemma, weighing what she had been taught about protocol and tradition against her growing sense that something should be done to help the guard who had been standing in the rain for so long. "Your Royal Highness," Lady Morrison ventured carefully, "you seem quite concerned about the guard. Is there something troubling you?" It was a gentle prompt, designed to help the princess articulate what was clearly a complex set of emotions and thoughts. Charlotte turned from the window, her expression serious beyond her years. "He's been standing there for so long, and he must be very cold and wet. I know he's doing his duty, but—" She paused, searching for words to express something that adult protocol seemed unable to address. "Shouldn't someone care about how he feels too?" The question hung in the air with the weight of profound innocence. Lady Morrison realized they were approaching one of those moments that would likely become part of palace lore, when a young royal's natural compassion challenged established traditions in a way that revealed both the strength and the limitations of formal protocol. Outside, Thomas had begun to attract attention from unexpected quarters. A group of military veterans, recognizing a kindred spirit in the rain-soaked guard, had gathered under a nearby awning to pay their respects. They stood silently, their own posture reflecting years of service and an understanding of the commitment being displayed before them. One elderly man wore a beret with regimental badges, another carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of former military service. They didn't speak, but their presence added a solemnity to the scene that transcended mere curiosity. The rain had intensified yet again, if such a thing seemed possible. What meteorologists would later describe as an unusually persistent weather system had settled over London, bringing with it the kind of sustained downpour that typically lasted minutes rather than hours. The storm drains were struggling to cope with the volume of water, and several streets in the surrounding area had begun to experience minor flooding. Yet through it all, Thomas maintained his position with a steadfastness that had begun to take on an almost mythical quality. Palace staff had begun to discuss the situation among themselves, though always with the understanding that royal protocol took precedence over personal comfort. The guard was performing his duty exactly as trained, and there was no regulation that suggested he should be relieved early due to rain, regardless of its intensity or duration. At the same time, his extraordinary endurance was creating a situation that went beyond normal ceremonial duty, entering territory where human concern began to compete with institutional tradition. The kitchen staff, who had prepared the refreshments for Princess Charlotte's tea party, found themselves glancing frequently toward the courtyard as they cleaned up from the event. Cook Margaret Henderson, who had worked in the palace for over 20 years, shook her head as she watched the guard through the service entrance window. That young man must be half drowned by now, she murmured to her assistant. Takes a special kind of dedication to stand there like that. Her assistant, a newer employee named Jamie, looked puzzled. Can't someone bring him an umbrella or something? Surely there's got to be some way to help? The question revealed the natural human response to seeing someone endure unnecessary hardship, even when that endurance was technically part of their job. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. Protocol is protocol, love. These guards are trained for exactly this sort of thing. But... She paused, considering. Can't say I've ever seen anyone stand through rain quite like this. Usually, even the worst weather breaks after an hour or two. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte had made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She had asked Lady Morrison to speak with her mother about the guard's situation, not to change protocol, but to explore whether there might be some appropriate way to acknowledge his extraordinary service. The request demonstrated a sophistication of thought that impressed the adults around her, showing an understanding that sometimes the most meaningful gestures work within established traditions rather than against them. The conversation between Lady Morrison and Princess Charlotte's mother occurred in private, as such discussions always did. However, the outcome became apparent when palace staff began to prepare something that hadn't been initially planned for the day's events. The exact nature of the preparation was kept confidential, but there was a sense of anticipation building among those who had been watching the guards' marathon vigil in the rain. Thomas, of course, remained unaware of these behind-the-scenes developments. His world had narrowed to the immediate physical challenge of maintaining his position despite increasingly difficult conditions. The cold had progressed beyond mere discomfort to a bone-deep chill that required conscious effort to manage. His breathing had become more deliberate, each exhalation a small cloud of warmth that dissipated instantly in the cold rain. Yet his military bearing remained intact, a testament to training that had prepared him for exactly these moments when duty and comfort diverged significantly. As word of the guard's endurance continued to spread, people began to gather despite the weather. Some came specifically to witness what was becoming an extraordinary display of dedication, others stumbled upon the scene and found themselves compelled to stay. The crowd was respectful but growing, united by a shared appreciation for witnessing something that transcended ordinary experience. They stood in the rain themselves, though with the protection of umbrellas and raincoats, becoming silent witnesses to a demonstration of commitment that seemed to speak to something fundamental about human character and duty. The 6th hour of rain brought with it an almost surreal quality to the scene unfolding at Buckingham Palace. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell had become the center of an impromptu gathering that included tourists, veterans, palace staff, and now members of the media from several countries. The story had transcended local interest and was being broadcast live on international news channels, with commentators describing it as an extraordinary demonstration of the dedication that defines the British Royal Guard. Thomas felt the weight of attention but remained laser-focused on his duty. The physical challenges had intensified considerably. His uniform, once a pristine example of military dress, had become a sodden testament to endurance. Water dripped steadily from every fold and edge of his red tunic, creating small streams that pooled around his boots. The brass buttons, though still gleaming through the rain, were the only elements of his appearance that retained their original luster. Everything else spoke of a man who had weathered a storm with unwavering determination. Inside the palace, Princess Charlotte had spent the better part of an hour in serious discussion with her mother and Lady Morrison. The 8-year-old princess had surprised everyone with the depth of her concern and the thoughtfulness of her proposed solution. She had not suggested that protocol be broken or that the guard be relieved of his duty early. Instead, she had proposed something that would work within royal tradition while acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances. "Mama," she had said with the earnest tone that children use when discussing matters they consider deeply important, "I know the guard must do his duty, and I think that's very noble. But couldn't we do our duty too? Couldn't we show that we notice his sacrifice and appreciate it?" The question had been asked with such sincerity that it had prompted a lengthy discussion about the balance between tradition and humanity, between protocol and compassion. The palace staff had been quietly preparing for something unprecedented. Word had spread through the staff quarters that Princess Charlotte had requested permission to make a gesture that would honor the guard's service while respecting all established protocols. The exact nature of this gesture remained a closely guarded secret, but there was a sense of anticipation building among those who had been watching the guard's marathon vigil. Cook Margaret Henderson had taken it upon herself to prepare a special thermos of hot tea, though she wasn't entirely sure if or when it might be needed. Her instinct to nurture, honed by years of caring for palace staff and residents, had been activated by the sight of the guard standing in the cold rain. 23 years I've been here, she told her assistant Jamie, and I've never seen anything quite like this. That young man deserves recognition for what he's doing out there. The crowd outside had grown to nearly 100 people, despite the continuing downpour. They stood in a respectful semicircle, maintaining proper distance while witnessing what many would later describe as one of the most moving displays of duty they had ever seen. Among them was retired Colonel James Wellington, who had served in the same regiment as Thomas years earlier. He stood ramrod straight despite his age, his own military bearing evident even in civilian clothes and rain gear. Magnificent, the colonel murmured to his wife, who had tried unsuccessfully to convince him to return home. Absolutely magnificent. This is what service looks like, Mary. This is why the Guard commands respect around the world. His voice carried a note of pride that suggested he was reliving his own years of service through Thomas's demonstration of dedication. Thomas had begun to employ mental techniques learned during his training to manage the increasingly challenging conditions. He focused on his breathing, using controlled exhalation to maintain core body heat. His mind alternated between complete presence in the moment and strategic distraction, sometimes cataloging the sounds around him, sometimes recalling warm memories of home. The technique wasn't perfect, but it helped him maintain the focus necessary to continue his vigil without compromising his military bearing. The international media coverage had reached the point where news anchors were providing updates on the Guard in the rain alongside coverage of more traditional news events. Social media had erupted with expressions of admiration, concern, and amazement. Videos of Thomas standing motionless in the downpour had been shared millions of times, often accompanied by comments about duty, dedication, and the human capacity for endurance. Some viewers expressed concern for his well-being, while others marveled at the tradition he represented. Palace security had established a discreet perimeter to manage the growing crowd while ensuring that Thomas could continue his duty without interference. The Guards were experienced in crowd management during royal events, but this situation was unique in its organic nature and the genuine emotional investment of the spectators. People weren't just watching a ceremony, they were witnessing something that spoke to fundamental questions about commitment, sacrifice, and the meaning of service. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Thomas's wife, had learned about her husband's situation through a colleague who had seen the news coverage. Her first instinct was worry, followed quickly by pride. She knew Thomas better than anyone and understood that he would never consider abandoning his post, regardless of the physical challenges. Still, she found herself checking the weather forecast obsessively and calculating how much longer his shift would continue. Their daughter Emma had seen the news coverage at her friend's house and had called home immediately. "Mummy, Daddy's on television. He's standing in the rain and everyone's talking about how brave he is." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and concern that reflected her growing understanding that her father's job sometimes required extraordinary sacrifice. Sarah had reassured her daughter while privately marveling at the situation that had made her husband an international symbol of dedication. As the seventh hour began, palace officials were engaged in delicate conversations about precedent and protocol. What Thomas was doing wasn't unprecedented in terms of Guards standing in bad weather, but the duration and intensity of this particular situation had created circumstances that went beyond normal parameters. Some officials advocated for maintaining standard protocol regardless of media attention, while others suggested that exceptional circumstances might warrant exceptional recognition. The debate was ultimately resolved by Princess Charlotte herself, who had spent the intervening time crafting a gesture that would honor both tradition and the extraordinary nature of the Guard's service. Her proposal had been discussed, refined, and ultimately approved by her mother and senior palace staff. The plan would unfold shortly, though Thomas remained unaware of the attention his dedication had generated both inside and outside the palace walls. The rain had achieved a kind of consistency that meteorologists would later describe as remarkable for its duration and intensity. London's drainage systems were being tested to their limits, and several areas of the city were experiencing minor flooding. Weather services had begun issuing warnings about travel conditions and encouraging people to avoid unnecessary outdoor activities. Yet through it all, Thomas maintained his position with a steadfastness that seemed to defy the natural human instinct to seek shelter. A group of school children on a field trip had arrived with their teachers, having specifically requested to see the guard who won't give up. Their teacher, Mrs. Patricia Holmes, had decided to use the situation as a teaching moment about perseverance and duty. The children stood quietly under umbrellas, their young faces serious as they tried to comprehend the dedication they were witnessing. One boy, no more than 7 years old, tugged on his teacher's coat and whispered, "Is he a real-life superhero?" Mrs. Holmes considered the question carefully before responding. "In a way, yes. He's showing us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they commit to something important. He's not fighting villains or flying through the air, but he's demonstrating something just as heroic, the willingness to do his job perfectly, even when it's difficult." The children absorbed this lesson with the seriousness that young minds bring to concepts that challenge their understanding of the world. Several asked if they could write letters to the guard to thank him for his service, a request that Mrs. Holmes promised to explore with palace officials after their visit concluded. Thomas could feel the attention of the crowd, though his training prevented him from acknowledging it directly. The energy of so many people focused on his performance created an additional layer of responsibility. He was no longer simply performing his assigned duty, he had become a symbol of something larger than himself. This realization brought with it both pride and humility, along with a renewed determination to maintain the highest possible standards until his shift concluded. The palace staff had begun final preparations for Princess Charlotte's gesture, though the exact timing remained flexible to ensure it would occur at the most appropriate moment. Kitchen staff had prepared special refreshments, security had been briefed on the modified protocols, and Lady Morrison had coached the princess on the precise wording and demeanor that would be most appropriate for such an unprecedented situation. As word spread through the palace that something special was being planned, staff members who weren't directly involved began finding reasons to position themselves near windows overlooking the courtyard. The anticipation was palpable, though it remained understated in the way that palace professionals managed all extraordinary events. This was history in the making, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were about to witness something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The international media coverage had reached the point where government officials were beginning to comment on the situation. The Prime Minister's office issued a statement praising the Guard's dedication as a reminder of the values that define British service and commitment. Military leaders from other countries began sharing their own stories of soldiers who had demonstrated similar dedication under challenging circumstances, turning Thomas's vigil into a broader conversation about the meaning of duty in the modern world. Colonel Wellington, still maintaining his vigil among the crowd, found himself approached by journalists seeking comment from someone with military experience. "What you're witnessing here," he told a reporter from the BBC, "is the embodiment of everything the Queen's Guard represents. Tradition, duty, and an unwavering commitment to excellence regardless of circumstances. This young man is honoring centuries of service with every minute he continues to stand at his post." The colonel's words would be quoted extensively in news coverage, helping to frame Thomas's endurance not as stubborn adherence to rules, but as a conscious choice to uphold values that transcended personal comfort. It was a perspective that resonated with viewers around the world, many of whom began to see the rain-soaked Guard as a symbol of steadfastness in an era often characterized by compromise and convenience. The 8th hour arrived with a subtle shift in atmosphere that only the most observant members of the crowd might have detected. Palace staff members were moving with purposeful efficiency behind the scenes, and there was an electricity in the air that suggested something significant was about to unfold. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, still maintaining his vigil in the relentless rain, remained focused on his duty, unaware that his extraordinary dedication was about to be acknowledged in a way that would surprise everyone present, including himself. Princess Charlotte had spent the morning carefully rehearsing her words and actions with Lady Morrison. The 8-year-old princess understood the gravity of what she was about to do, not because it broke protocol, but because it established new precedent for how royal recognition could honor exceptional service while respecting established traditions. Her mother had provided final approval for the gesture, recognizing that her daughter's compassionate instincts had led to something both unprecedented and entirely appropriate. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people, despite the continuing downpour. International journalists stood alongside local tourists, military veterans beside curious passers-by, all united in their fascination with the guard who had stood motionless for over 7 hours in increasingly challenging conditions. The scene had taken on a quality that transcended mere spectacle. It had become a gathering of people drawn to witness something that spoke to fundamental human values of commitment and perseverance. Thomas felt the cold in ways he had never experienced during his 12 years of service. His core body temperature had dropped significantly, and maintaining warmth required conscious effort and technique. Yet his military bearing remained perfect, his rifle positioned at exactly the prescribed angle, his gaze steady and focused ahead. To any observer, he appeared as composed and dignified as he had when he first took his position that morning, a testament to training that prepared guards for exactly these moments when duty demanded extraordinary endurance. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the palace, having obtained special permission to be present for what palace officials had described only as a significant recognition of exceptional service. She stood among the crowd with Emma, their 6-year-old daughter, who wore her best dress despite the rain because, as she had explained to her mother, "Daddy's going to be on television again, and I want to look nice for him." Sarah's pride in her husband's dedication was matched by her concern for his physical well-being, though she knew him well enough to understand that nothing short of collapse would make him abandon his post. The palace doors opened with ceremonial precision at precisely 3:47 p.m., and Princess Charlotte emerged accompanied by Lady Morrison and 2 senior palace officials. The princess wore a formal coat over her dress, and, despite her young age, she carried herself with the dignity befitting her royal status. In her hands, she held a silver tray bearing items that would soon become part of royal history, though their exact nature remained visible only to those closest to the palace entrance. The crowd immediately recognized the significance of the moment. Conversations ceased, cameras focused, and even the journalists who had been providing live commentary fell silent as they realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. Princess Charlotte walked across the rain-soaked courtyard with measured steps, her small figure creating a powerful contrast against the imposing architecture of Buckingham Palace. Thomas became aware of movement in his peripheral vision but maintained his focus straight ahead, as protocol demanded. However, as Princess Charlotte approached, palace officials signaled that he should acknowledge her presence according to standard procedure for royal interactions. He executed a perfect salute, his movement precise despite the hours of standing in the cold rain, then returned to attention position as the princess came to a stop directly in front of him. "Sergeant Mitchell," Princess Charlotte began, her young voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, "I have watched you stand at your post for many hours today, through rain that would have sent most people running for shelter. Your dedication to duty represents the very best of what the Queen's Guard stands for, and I wanted to personally thank you for your extraordinary service." The words, carefully chosen and rehearsed, carried a weight far beyond their simplicity. This was recognition from royalty for exceptional service, but it was also recognition from one human being to another for a demonstration of character that had moved even an 8-year-old princess to action. Thomas felt emotion rise in his chest, though his expression remained appropriately composed. Princess Charlotte lifted the silver tray to reveal its contents, a thermos of hot tea, a warm towel, and a handwritten note that she had composed herself that morning. "I cannot ask you to abandon your post," she continued, "for I understand that duty cannot be compromised. But I can ensure that you know your sacrifice has been seen, appreciated, and honored." The gesture was perfectly calibrated to work within royal protocol while addressing the human dimension of Thomas's situation. She was not offering to relieve him of his duty or suggesting that he seek shelter, but rather acknowledging his service in a way that honored both his commitment and her own position as a member of the royal family. It was diplomacy and compassion combined in a form that would have impressed seasoned palace officials, yet it came from the genuine concern of a child who had been moved by witnessing extraordinary dedication. Thomas accepted the items with appropriate ceremony, though protocol prevented him from consuming the tea or using the towel while on duty. The gesture itself was what mattered, the recognition that his service had meaning beyond mere adherence to regulations. He understood that this moment would become part of palace history, and he felt the weight of that significance even as he appreciated the personal kindness that had motivated it. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," he replied with formal precision. "It is my honor to serve, and your recognition of that service means more than I can express." His words were few but heartfelt, carrying the gratitude of a soldier who had received acknowledgement from the very institution he had sworn to protect. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a sound that echoed across the courtyard and seemed to lift some of the weight of the gray, rain-filled sky. International journalists began providing live commentary on what they recognized as an unprecedented moment in royal protocol, while social media exploded with videos and photographs of the young princess honoring the dedicated guard. Princess Charlotte remained for several more minutes, engaging Thomas in brief conversation that demonstrated her understanding of military service and her genuine interest in his experience. She asked about his family, his years of service, and whether he had ever faced similar challenges during his duties. Her questions revealed both natural curiosity and a sophisticated understanding that this was a moment for connection as much as ceremony. Emma Mitchell, watching from the crowd with her mother, whispered urgently, "Mummy, the princess is talking to Daddy. She's really talking to him." Her excitement was infectious, and Sarah found herself smiling through tears of pride at seeing her husband receive such extraordinary recognition. The little girl would later tell her classmates that a real princess had thanked her father for being brave, a story that would be repeated and remembered for years to come. As Princess Charlotte prepared to return to the palace, she made one final gesture that surprised even her accompanying staff. She stepped closer to Thomas and said, in a voice meant only for him, "My great-grandmother would have been very proud to see such dedication. You represent the best of what she valued in service to the crown." The reference to Queen Elizabeth II, delivered with the sincerity that only a child could bring to such words, carried an emotional impact that Thomas would carry with him for the rest of his life. The princess returned to the palace to thunderous applause from the crowd, though she acknowledged the recognition with the composed dignity that royal training had instilled in her despite her young age. Palace officials later confirmed that the gesture had been entirely her initiative, developed from her genuine concern for the guard's well-being and her desire to honor exceptional service within appropriate protocols. Thomas returned to his vigil with renewed purpose, though the physical challenges remained unchanged. The rain continued to fall with the same intensity, his uniform remained thoroughly soaked, and the cold still penetrated to his bones. However, the recognition he had received from Princess Charlotte had transformed his endurance from simple adherence to duty into something approaching a sacred trust. He was no longer simply standing guard, he was embodying the values that the royal family itself had chosen to honor. The remaining hour of his shift passed with remarkable speed. The crowd, energized by what they had witnessed, remained despite the continuing rain. Many took photographs and videos, not just of Thomas, but of each other witnessing what they knew was a historic moment. Veterans saluted, children waved, and tourists from around the world captured images that would help them remember the day they saw dedication and compassion intersect in front of Buckingham Palace. When Thomas's replacement arrived precisely on schedule, the changing of the guard ceremony proceeded with additional solemnity befitting the extraordinary circumstances. The incoming guard had been briefed on the situation and understood that he was not merely taking over a routine post, but continuing a vigil that had captured international attention and royal recognition. Thomas transferred his duties with the same precision he had maintained throughout the day, though those closest to the ceremony could see the exhaustion he had hidden so well during his extended watch. As Thomas finally walked toward the palace barracks, the crowd provided a final ovation that followed him until he disappeared from view. He carried with him the silver tray bearing Princess Charlotte's gifts, tangible reminders of a day when duty and compassion had combined to create something memorable and meaningful. The story of the guard who stood in the rain and the princess who honored his service spread around the world within hours. News outlets from dozens of countries carried the story, often leading their broadcasts with footage of Princess Charlotte approaching the rain-soaked guard. The image became iconic almost immediately, representing something timeless about service, recognition, and the human connections that transcend protocol and tradition. In the days that followed, Thomas received letters and messages from around the world, thanking him for his demonstration of dedication and praising his embodiment of military values. Princess Charlotte's gesture was equally praised, with commentators noting how her compassionate response had created a moment that honored tradition while demonstrating that recognition and kindness could work within established structures rather than against them. The rain finally stopped that evening, just as the sun set over London. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace returned to its usual bustling activity, tourists resumed their normal patterns, and the palace guards continued their traditional duties. But, for those who had witnessed the events of June 15, 2023, something fundamental had changed in their understanding of what service meant and how extraordinary dedication could inspire extraordinary recognition. Thomas Mitchell returned to duty the following week to find himself something of a celebrity among his fellow guards, though he handled the attention with the same quiet dignity he had shown during his vigil in the rain. Princess Charlotte resumed her normal activities as well, though palace staff noted that she had developed an even greater interest in the traditions and duties of those who served her family. The silver tray and its contents were preserved as part of palace history, while the handwritten note from Princess Charlotte was framed and placed in Thomas's home, where it would remind his family for generations to come of the day when duty, dedication, and compassion combined to create something truly extraordinary under the grey skies of London.